I'm excited that we've got a speaker series to share with y'all at the business meeting this go round. When all of this started back in May, we thought it was going to be a one-off thing. We kept it simple, did a few agency updates. Unfortunately, it has persisted longer than we wanted to, but are excited that we've got some fantastic speakers joining us to tell you about some of the things going on in the groundwater world. It did get quiet for a while, or it felt like it. And all of a sudden things are hopping. So we've got a lot to share. We've got some great speakers. First, we have Andrea Krosky, who is a geoscientist and discipline lead at the Texas Water Development Board. She's in the Innovative Waters Technology section doing, ASR work. In the last legislative session, House Bill 721 directed the Development Board to do a study on ASR projects throughout Texas, kind of a suitability study. That effort's been underway for quite a while now, about 18 months, probably not even. You guys had to work fast. They've put together a great report. It just got its final finishing touches a few weeks back, I believe. And excited to have Andrea here to discuss the survey and the results. Welcome, Andrea. I'm going to turn my camera off, and then I will pop back on when it's time for questions. And folks out there, if you have questions for Andrea, feel free to put them in the chat. You can also raise your hand during the Q&A and we can unmute you. All right, welcome, Andrea. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much for that warm welcome, Leah. I really appreciate it. The statewide survey of aquifer suitability for ASR and AR. This was a report and survey that was mandated by House Bill 721, passed by the Texas legislature back in 2019, and it's to determine the occurrence, quantity, quality, and availability of aquifers in which aquifer storage and recovery projects or aquifer recharge projects are feasible. I promise this isn't a trick. I'm not already done with my presentation. But I wanted to start out by thanking folks. The statewide survey was performed by a contractor, and this is my first public presentation of the survey. So I ask you all for your patience as I do this live demo and try to answer your questions, as I'm still trying to learn everything from this immense survey. I would like to thank HDR and their subcontractors for their diligent work to complete this immense project and on such an aggressive timeline. Over 24 of their staff and colleagues worked on this for over 9 months in 2020. Additionally, I have many thanks to give to my fellow coworkers and staff at the Texas Water Development Board. We worked closely with HDR as they developed the methodology and gathered source data and created the story map and wrote the report. And it was truly a cross-departmental effort that required utilizing multiple strengths in the agency. For those of you that do know me, you'll know my background is in geology and brackish groundwater mapping. And so I really needed their help in learning things, especially as it relates to the WAM and water planning data. So I want to start with some pillars of the survey before we jump to the live demo. Many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with this type of infrastructure, but to provide the definitions for the survey, I would like to say that aquifer storage and recovery, or I'll say ASR, is using a well to inject water into an aquifer for the purpose of subsequent recovery and beneficial use. And then aquifer recharge, or I'll keep saying AR, is the intentional recharge of an aquifer, but not necessarily for the recovery of that water. And it may be done for several reasons, including reducing declines to the water table or spring flows, or to improve water quality and mitigate subsidence. So both of these types of infrastructure were evaluated by the survey. Per legislative requirements, HDR conducted the survey based on 3 screening criteria: hydrogeological characteristics, excess water, and water supply needs. Often during the 7 months that HDR was working on completing the draft deliverables, I commented that they had to complete the 3 screening studies just to get to the point where they could do the relative statewide rating. So really it's 4 very technical studies wrapped in one survey. So let's look at these screenings. The first one, hydrogeological, was to map the parameters for all 31 major and minor aquifers twice. Once with the parameters that are pertinent to aquifer storage and recovery, and then again with the parameters that were pertinent to aquifer recharge. These hydrogeological parameters included characteristics such as storage potential, transmissivity, infiltration characteristics, storativity, recoverability, and water quality. The second screening was to map the water available for injection or recharge, or what the survey and the House bill termed excess water. For this survey, excess water was considered water sources that are not claimed or obligated to provide for current or future water supply demands in the draft 2021 regional water plans, and could potentially be available for ASR or AR projects. The 3 water supply categories that were looked at included surface water, which included appropriated and unappropriated waters, such as run-of-river, reservoirs, rain and stormwater, and then reclaimed water and groundwater. The third screening was to map the location of water supply needs based on the draft 2021 regional water plans. And these included water supplies from 3 water user groups: municipal, manufacturing, and steam electric. Irrigation, mining, and municipal county other water user groups were not included in the statewide survey due to the unavailability of spatial data at a resolution greater than the county level. This survey identifies areas of Texas with 3 criteria: major and minor aquifers, excess water, and water supply needs. Benefits to the survey are that it's free and public, not necessarily free if you're a taxpayer, but free in terms of, it shouldn't show up in your guys's GCD budgets. Also, it's a big picture study, and it provides a fresh look at water planning data. Also, what was really important for this one is data accessibility. It's a very data intensive survey. And one of the things about that data is we wanted that data to be versatile. So it was intentionally structured in such a way that a GIS user can take the GIS files and reevaluate the data, looking through a perspective that's important to them or their planning process, or the criteria that they feel should have more weight. Also, the survey plugs into the water planning process. We used a lot of water planning data in order to do the survey, and it really dovetails in with it. In terms of uses that we've envisioned so far for the survey, foremost, it's a conversation starter. Also, we wanted to empower folks to explore the data and then identify areas that could warrant a feasibility analysis that perhaps has never been considered for ASR or AR before, or maybe an area that was considered but maybe deserves a second look. Also, we envision it as the ability to seek potential for collaboration amongst water user groups for things such as conjunctive use or regionalization. And then also stakeholders can arrive at their own conclusions given what their needs or interests are, given to, once again, that intentional, versatile structure of the data. Now, whenever there's a big undertaking like this, there are always challenges and limitations. Challenges for this statewide survey include the scale. So it's both a benefit and a challenge. Doing such a large scale study requires very large amounts of data. Also, data availability was a challenge. There's an immense amount of work to do and an aggressive time frame. And so the information that we needed to use needed to be readily available. And the survey relies heavily on the water planning data because of this reason. Also, we had to resample a lot of data to get it into compatible scales. The source for the data was usually created for a purpose other than what we were using it for. And so there had to be some manipulation to get it to work for our purposes. And as I've mentioned, it was a pretty short timeline for a pretty big project. And also quantifying the suitability of areas for aquifer storage and recovery or aquifer recharge projects independent of important aspects such as infrastructure and economics was often difficult and continues to be a challenge for people to wrap their heads around. In terms of limitations, the results of the survey indicate the relative suitability of areas in the state for aquifer storage and recovery and aquifer recharge based on those 3 statutory criteria. And you can compare the scores between aquifers in Texas, but not outside of the state. Also, no scores were given to grid cells that lacked any one of the 3 criteria. Just because a resource or need wasn't identified doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. It just wasn't identified by this survey. And conversely, just because a resource or need was identified, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's guaranteed to be available or appropriate for a project. For example, the availability of excess water is contingent on things like environmental flows, existing water rights, permitted impoundment volumes, associated reservoir operations, and seasonal conditions that we couldn't consider at a statewide scale. Oh, sorry, I didn't realize that was in the way. Okay. So also, the survey doesn't replace the need for a site-specific analysis. And it's also impossible to account for all the seasonal local variability that often makes aquifer storage and recovery or AR projects attractive given the scale and timeline of the survey. And also, the survey results should not be considered agency recommended locations for projects. And conversely, a high suitability score from the survey is not required for a successful project, nor does the lack of a rating discount an area from hosting a project. Receiving any final suitability rating indicates that at least that area has the 3 screening criteria. Okay, so with all that laid out, we're going to do the part that makes me super nervous, which is the live demo. So I'll switch here from my PowerPoint presentation to the website here. And Leah, could you just confirm that you guys can see the website?
Yes, we're in on the map right now. We're seeing the southern part of the US.
Great, perfect. Okay, so even though this wasn't in the legislative mandate, we identified the spatial nature of the data and that the project really required a public data display. And so what I'm displaying here is our public data display, and it puts over 101 interactive maps at the fingertips of our stakeholders. It went public on December 15th to coincide with our deadline for the legislative report. And along the top here, you can see there are 8 tabs that you can click on. And given the time available for this presentation, I won't go through all these. But if you want to explore them, each of these tabs is kind of like a little PowerPoint presentation with interactive maps explaining the different screenings. But we've gone ahead and jumped ahead here to what's called the Explore the Data tab. And the first thing I wanted to point out was that we created a grid to cover all of Texas. So we would have something to, get all of the data into the same scale and format. And these grid cells are about 50,000 feet by 50,000 feet, or roughly 90 square miles. And I'll turn on our county boundaries here, and we'll zoom into Ector County so we can get an idea of kind of the scale of these grid cells. So hopefully what you're seeing on the screen now are the black outline of the Texas counties, and then these gray grid cells. And so you can see it takes about 9 of them to cover an average size county like Ector County.
And Andrea, I'll just let you know it is functioning. It was zooming in on the county just like you wanted it to, so it's coming through.
Great. Yeah, I was definitely worried about a little bit of delay. So thanks for confirming that, Leah. Okay, so now what we're looking at is the final suitability rating for aquifer storage and recovery. For this live demo, I'm going to focus on the results for aquifer storage and recovery, but just keep in mind that there was also an analysis for aquifer recharge that we won't have time to go over today. The final suitability ratings are in 7 categories. So when you look at the map, the tan areas that you see is where no major or minor aquifer was assigned to one of the grid cells. The dark gray areas is where there was neither an excess water nor a need identified. The middle gray color areas are where there is no need identified. And the lightest gray areas is where there was no excess water identified. And then any area, any grid cell that has a color of blue in it has all 3 of those screening criteria in proximity to each other. So the lightest blue areas being the less suitable areas, medium blue being the moderately suitable areas, and the dark blue being the most suitable areas. For this final suitability rating, it took all 3 screening criteria into consideration. And for each of the grid cells that was assigned a major or minor aquifer, a search was done to the surrounding 24 grid cells to identify an excess water and a need to pair with that aquifer. All right, so the example that we're going to look at is in Gonzales County. So let's zoom to Gonzales County. Now I'm going to turn on the county layer too so we can see Gonzales County there. All right, so I chose Gonzales County because we know from the 2021 Region L Water Plan that there's a planned ASR project, and I thought it might be interesting to see how the data gathered by the survey looks in this area. So when we look at Gonzales County, we can see that the highest scoring grid cell is this one here in Luling County. And when I click on it, we can see a lot of data comes up for the attributes of it. And I promise we'll look at this in more detail. But the location of the proposed ASR project is somewhere probably in the vicinity of the town of Gonzales down here in this grid cell, which is a lighter blue color, and so received a slightly lower score. So what I can do is I can view these in the attribute table, and I can filter these so that just those 2 grid cells display so we can compare them. So the first grid cell that contains Gonzales County is number 5258, and the row column ID for the grid cell that contains Luling is 5157. And so now you'll see the table down here has been filtered down to just those 2 so we can look at them. And I've highlighted the grid cell with the town of Gonzales to help identify it. So what do these two grid cells have in common? The first thing that stands out to me is that the highest scoring aquifer identified in both these areas is the Carrizo-Wilcox aquifer. And then when we look, the grid cell that contains the town of Gonzales has a slightly higher score for the Carrizo-Wilcox than that for Luling. But when we look at the final suitability rating, the Luling grid cell scored slightly higher, which is why it's that darker blue color. From here, if we wanted to dive deeper in the data, we could look and see what the excess water ID scores are. And we'll see how much time it is, because I'd like to leave time for questions. So we might just look at excess water first. So let's look at the excess water for the Gonzales, or the highlighted grid cell. And we see that the excess water score came from the same grid cell as the aquifer ID score, 5258. So what I can do is I can go back over here to our legend, and this contains the 101 layers. So there's a lot of data in here. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn off our final suitability rating and go down to our excess water grids. And if I turn on this layer, what it's showing is when we looked at all the combination of the surface and groundwater, surface, groundwater, and reclaimed water, and combine them, this is the score. So we can see both the Luling grid cell and the Gonzales grid cell both scored high in excess water. But let's say we're curious at what water supplies were identified by the survey. So when I click on this excess water grid cell, we can see that it received a high score, and that it received scores for both surface water and for reclaimed water, but no score for groundwater. And we can see that the surface water score is the highest. So let's go see what surface water the survey identified. And we can do that by going down to the surface water grid and turning that one on. And when we click on the surface water grid cell, it breaks it down into whether the score came from appropriated or unappropriated water supplies. And here we can see that the score for excess water has come from the unappropriated surface water. And so what we can do then is we can turn on our unappropriated flow points from the WAM. And I will turn off the grid so you can see them a little better. And I'll turn on this grid so we can see it. So now we can see here in this grid cell for Gonzales that there are a lot of points in it. And all these are the gauging stations from the WAM. And I went ahead, to save us time, I went ahead and looked to see what the highest scoring gauging station from the WAM was for the unappropriated scoring in this grid cell. And it was one from the Guadalupe River. And let's see if I can narrow us down on that one in case you guys want to see what that attribute table looks like. So we got to go back down to the excess water, and I want to open the attribute table for the unappropriated flow WAM points. And then I am going to zoom in a little more, because that will help limit the points it's looking at. Oops, there we go. And I'm going to filter on that unique ID that I identified earlier. So we want to look at unique ID, and hopefully this will copy and paste like it did when I practiced earlier. This is the unique identifier for the highest scoring WAM point for unappropriated flow. And so that's the table we're looking at right now. And some of these names are a little long, so I have to expand the columns here to get a better look at them. And so we can see that The score for volume was really high at 1. All the scores are normalized from range of 0 to 1, and that the frequency was pretty high and that the duration was kind of average. And it's a combination of those scores that come up with the rating for the excess water. So it looked at volume, frequency, and duration, and also the distance to coast to account for freshwater flows. But that's just a very high level look at this. As I said, it's about 4 very technical studies in one. So as you can imagine, could go into a lot of detail if we wanted. But I wanted to give a high level example of how you can explore the data. And I also want to leave time for us for questions. And so I'll go ahead and stop my live demo here, and I'll be ready for questions.
Thank you so much, Andrea. That is quite an undertaking for the timeline you were on in particular. Wow, that is a lot of layers and a really great live demo. And folks will be able to, they can access on the development board's website. We'll have these PowerPoints open so you guys can access it. We did get a couple questions that came in, and if anyone out there does have questions they want to submit, you can type those in, go for it. But I did see a couple people asking about the economic piece and whether or not maybe there was like a plan to incorporate that as something that would be considered in terms of suitability.
Economics is really tricky because it changes over time. I mean, just look at the economics of, 2019 versus 2020, right? So currently there isn't a plan to add that. And like I said, this survey is more of like a conversation starter and a way to explore the data. And that economics piece is like the next piece. So, first you'd kind of look for areas that look interesting, might have some of these 3 categories that could go to an ASR AR project. And then the next step would be to do a feasibility study for that area. And that's where infrastructure and economics would be considered.
Mm-hmm. And just to pick up on that, I guess, when this gets delivered to the legislature and they take a look at it, that could be the next thing they ask for y'all to undertake.
I try not to predict what the legislature will do.
Probably smart. Probably smart. Okay, I did have another one come in. It's kind of a basic question, but maybe you could give a couple examples of how someone might use this.
Yeah, so the idea would be that someone would, whether you're an area that's trying to consider what your needs and potential aquifer potential is and excess water is. So it's people that are, for people that are curious about exploring for new water infrastructure projects or ways to help manage their water supply. And so they would use it to help kind of flag or take that first really high level bird's eye look at, does our area have any, areas where all 3 of these criteria are in proximity of each other. And then you could say, dig into that data and say like, well, what is the survey saying is available for our area? And it's like, if those components look interesting to them, then that would launch into the feasibility study. So it would really be used by people that are curious to see if aquifer storage and recovery or aquifer recharge could be infrastructure that could potentially improve their water reliability and supply.
Okay, great. And I do have a hand up, so I am going to Jason, I have unmuted you if you would like to ask your question. Jason, you're unmuted, but we're not hearing you.
Lee, it looks like he put his in the comments.
Oh, great. Okay, Perfect. I will read that then instead. His question was if you had any estimates for total ASR potential statewide.
I don't have any of those numbers off the top of my head, but I could go back to that. Maybe it'll let me escape from it. So for example, I guess that's the AR one. Now it's being a little slow drawing. There we go. So if you look at the state as a whole, I think one of the big takeaways was more or less, the same characteristics that make an aquifer good to be like a major or minor aquifer provide potential for doing ASR or AR. And so anywhere in the state where you see a blue color is somewhere where the survey identified all three of these screening criteria together. And if I remember correctly, it's just about at half the state. But once again, remember these are like 90 square mile grid cells. So there is a bit of coarseness because it is a statewide survey.
Right. So just then to clarify, so this really looked at the suitability, but not the actual capacity for
Correct.
ASR. Okay, fantastic. Wonderful. Well, I'm going to take one last look here and see if we had any other questions come in, and I'm not seeing any. But this is a really great tool, a lot of good work, and it's available, it's out there. We appreciate you coming and sharing it. The recording of this, as well as the slides, will all be made available to attendees, so you guys can check it out and play around with those, the layers on that. And am I correct that you guys built like a story map to go this as well, to kind of explain for the user kind of how it goes? So that's another resource that you guys put together and went above and beyond in terms of this survey.
Yeah, and I would like to point out too, I don't know if the email's gone out yet. It's supposed to go out this week, but we will be doing an hour long webinar where the contractor HDR will be helping to present on some of the technical aspects of the survey on February 17th. So keep your eyes peeled for that webinar invite.
Check your weekly updates. I'll have it in there.
Great. Thanks, Leah.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Andrea. Really appreciate that.